All right, good morning, everyone. It is 9 o'clock, and we are so pleased to be back with another edition of Mornings with O'Keefe, a special 90-minute edition. So, this is a really special program. Very glad you could join us. I'm just going to wait a couple seconds for folks to log on. I'm seeing our participant number growing as folks get logged in. So we'll just wait a couple more seconds. But in the meantime, I just want to welcome you and thank you again for being here. My name is Molly. I manage adult programs at the O'Keefe Museum, and it is always a pleasure to be here monthly with these Mornings with O'Keefe programs. I would like to begin by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keefe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude in acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. I would also like to extend a thank you to our members and donors who are here today because it's from your support that make these free programs possible. So thank you so much. And if you're not a member, but you're interested in learning more about what a membership offers, please consider joining and reading more about membership at gokm.org/membership. Throughout this talk, please place your questions in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. We will try to answer as many as we can at the end of the conversation. Please note that following today's talk, a recording will be made available on the Georgia O'Keefe Museum's website in a week or two once captions in English and Spanish have been added. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters this morning. We are joined by three very special guests. First, we have Dale Cronkrite, who is the head of conservation here at the Georgia O'Keefe Museum. We have Laura Joseph, director of curatorial affairs, and then we also have Elizabeth Ernst, head of research collections and services. All of these folks are joining us here from the museum, from their special respective locations, so we get to have a bit of insight into where everyone is working, where everyone is researching, and all to celebrate the wonderful and dynamic story of one specific painting, Ram's Skull with Brown Leaves, 1936, which you can see behind Laura Joseph, which is on exhibit in the museum right now. So you actually get to see the actual painting as it's being discussed by these three experts, all of whom will have something very special to reveal about its context and its journey. So without any further delay, I will go ahead and pass things over to our esteemed panel, and looking forward to learning even more about this very special painting. And thank you all for being here today.
Thanks, Molly. I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint, everybody, but this, as Molly said, this is a really special morning with O'Keefe because what we've decided to do is to have three presenters and to have us all in different locations. So it's going to be a more dynamic presentation, hopefully, and give you some insights about this incredible painting, and in particular, how it is that we take a work of art by Georgia O'Keeffe and investigate its context. When did she do it? What was going on in the world when she did it? How do those factors affect the subject matter that she paints? Ram's Skull with Brown Leaves is 1936. And so what's going on leading up to this moment in time? Where is she? Who is she with? What's going on around her? And those kinds of insights. It takes the joint resources of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum that are so incredibly rich, deep, and special. We have archives, we have a conservation laboratory with analytical capability, we have art historians who are checking her letters and so on. And so that's what today's program is really about. So I'm going to share my screen and pull this up. And Molly, you'll tell me please, if we get the right slide on the screen.
Yes, it's perfect with just the slide.
Wonderful, wonderful. So as you can see, we have a beautiful painting here. It's a floating skull of a traditional Spanish goat here in New Mexico with two brown leaves. The leaves are sort of floating oddly in space. We have an ambiguous white background. And so there are lots of questions here. What was she thinking? What was going on? And so I'm going to, hang on a second, talked about some of the resources here at the George O'Keeffe Museum. I'm going to be turning the program over here to Liz Ernst shortly. Liz is actually in this space in the research library. She has the Spanish goat skull behind her. And of course, Laura is in the galleries and is going to be talking about the historical context of the work. But one of the great riches of the George O'Keeffe Museum, besides having obviously more works by George O'Keeffe, along with correspondence and records and criticisms that were published in the paper, we also have George O'Keeffe's artistic studio materials, her paints, her pastels, her charcoals. And obviously we have the personal collections that O'Keeffe had in both of her homes at Abiquiu and at Ghost Ranch, including a number of the skulls, one of which you're about to see. So ram skull with brown leaves was painted in 1936. It's an oil on canvas. It's 30 by 36 inches. And it's on loan to us from the Roswell Museum. Well, I'll be talking more about that, but many of you know that the Roswell Museum in southern New Mexico suffered a devastating flood on October the 19th and 20th of 2024. Thankfully, this painting was spared a lot of water damage, but the rest of the museum's collections were not so lucky. So we appreciate Roswell Museum entrusting us with the loan of this painting so that we can share it with all of you. The painting was incidentally painted 90 years ago. And what's interesting coincidence is that the Roswell Museum was first established in 1935 as a federal art center in the Works Progress Administration during the Depression. And it opened in 1937, which is the first year that this painting was exhibited at an American Place by Alfred Stieglitz. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Liz Ernst, and she'll talk about some of the research materials that she was able to uncover related to this painting. Liz?
All right, thank you, Dale. As Dale says, I am in the museum's library, and I'm going to give a quick overview of when and where O'Keeffe was when she was first starting to travel to New Mexico and encountering and painting the bones in the landscape. So 1929 is her first extended trip to New Mexico, where she's staying primarily in Taos, traveling to other spots around the region. She learns to drive and buys a car in New Mexico, but bones are not depicted in her paintings this year. 1930, 1931, she comes back to New Mexico for the summer, mostly in the Taos Alcalde area. She does paint bones and first starts writing about bones at that time. 1932, 1933, she does not visit New Mexico. 1934, she comes back again for the summer, and this is her first visit to Ghost Ranch, a dude ranch north of Abiquiu that Nature magazine founder Arthur Pack has a controlling interest in at the time. Dale, slide please, and thank you. In 1935, she drives back out for the summer. She's staying in Alcalde before she moves to a room at Ghost Ranch. She moves into the room in August and stays there to November. She's traveling, as she typically does, around the region, Navajo Nation, back to Taos. In 1936, she drives back out again. She is now staying in Ghost Ranch, and she lives in the Ghost Ranch house that she later buys in 1940. And this is the year that ram skull with brown leaves is painted. So on your left here, you see an Ansel Adams photo of Taos Pueblo, probably taken in 1929 for a publication that he produces in 1930 of Taos Pueblo. On your right is Georgia O'Keeffe at Ghost Ranch in 1936, sitting on a portal with a pile of mail on her lap, adjusting her headscarf. Slide, please. O'Keeffe writes with excitement about her early summers in New Mexico, the landscape, the people, what she's working on, where she's traveling. And in 1931, on a night that she can't sleep in Alcalde, New Mexico, she wrote to art and music critic Henry McBride, "I don't know what art is all about. It all puzzles me very much. 10 weeks away from New York. Most of it spent by the roadside in that famous Ford that I now drive very well, attempting to paint landscape. I must think it important or I wouldn't work so hard at it. Then I see that the end of my studio is a large pile of bones, and then I wonder what painting is all about. What will I do with those bones and sticks and stones? When I leave the landscape, it seems I am going to work with these funny things that I now think feel very much like it. But maybe I will not." Later in 1936, when she paints Ram Skull with brown leaves, she has just spent the first summer living at the house that she will eventually purchase. And she's really immersed in the area and painting the landscape, the cliffs, the hills, the architecture of the area. This all becomes her subject matter for the next 35 years. She writes her husband, Alfred Stieglitz, regularly that summer, as she typically does. Similar to the summers before, she's corresponding about the landscape, her daily life, trying to convey the beauty of it, the emotion of it, the simple, quiet moments of moonrises over the cliffs, and exciting moments related to the furious rainstorms that they're getting that summer. She's sharing about her travels, such as traveling to the Navajo Nation, where she is traversing through the pillars of pink and red sandstone, reaching a high pass where sheep are taken for summer grazing, traveling down into a crack in the earth by mule. And she just writes about constantly how about she's amazed with the landscape and, quote, "a world just so big I can't take it in at all." She also mentions bones and finding a magnificent skull in the house rafters at Ghost Ranch, and then bringing a huge cow head back from a road trip. We also know from her letters that she is painting and drawing regularly that summer in 1936. And she writes in August about working for days on the stone porch floor because that's the way that she says she really can only see these paintings. And at this time, she's focused on a couple of deer and steer skull paintings. But by the time she's leaving New York, she notes that she really doesn't have too many paintings to pack up to bring back, and that she's mostly excited about her works of the place that she's calling the Black Place, which is at the edge of Navajo Nation. Slide, please. So why bones? Objects from the natural world were a part of her still life practice from her early years. And here we can see a drawing of grapes from 1901, 1902. This, she would have been about 14 or 15 at the time. And then on the right, Untitled Dead Rabbit with Copper Pot, which was completed in 1908 while she was at the Art Student League in New York. So she's painting shells and leaves and flowers, wood and seaweed, all of these things from the various places that she's living and traveling throughout her life. And they all appear before the skulls and the bones do. And she says that bones were symbols of the desert to her, nothing more. And she connected them with really her experience of the landscape of the Southwest and admired them for their shape and the beauty. And rather than death, she saw them as a reminder of life, saying, quote, "To me, they are strangely more living than the animals walking around," end quote. So why was she finding so many bones? Slide, please. O'Keeffe starts painting the bones during the Great Depression, a worldwide economic downturn that begins in 1929 and lasts until 1939. And this was particularly bad for New Mexico in the agricultural sector because the state was very rural during the 1930s, with many people raising crops and livestock. Dry farmers suffered from a prolonged drought that was so bad and dried up portions New Mexico that they became part of the Dust Bowl in the kind of more northeast region. Ranchers also struggled with the drought and a shrinking marketplace. Many ranchers and farmers fell behind in their financial situations and were forced to sell and leave behind their land. And in addition to the drought in northern New Mexico, there was also extreme winter weather with record-setting snowfalls and temperatures during the winter of 1931, 1932. The storms that came through that time buried villages and pueblos, leaving people and livestock starving starving with many, many losses. In fact, Rio Arriba County, where Abiquiu and Ghost Ranch are located, the record snowfall still dates from November 1931, where they received 36 inches in one day. And that's a lot for this area. So there was also man-made conditions of rapid deforestation happening at that town, rerouting of water sources, overgrazing of the livestock, all leading to depletion of resources, soil erosion, loss of plants and animals. Slide, please. In 1934, the Taylor Grazing Act was signed into law, and this ended open range on public lands and created regulated, permitted grazing districts with the intent to improve rangeland conditions and regulate their use. So the act enabled federal government to regulate, remove, and control unauthorized excess livestock and feral horses to restore the range conditions. And there are stories from community members in northern New Mexico of large numbers of wild horses being shot at this time and bones littering the landscape and the water holes. There was also the Navajo Livestock Reduction Program, which sought to reduce the number of sheep and goats grazing on Navajo lands, which was put in place for the same reasons that I just mentioned. And this program was tragic in many ways and had a devastating long-term impact on the Navajo society, economy, and way of life, such that it is often referred to as the second long walk. Their animals were much more than a food supply or income source. And while it was initially voluntary, in 1933, by 1935, it was mandatory, and by the end of the program, in 1946, the Navajo sheep numbers were cut in half from just over 1 million to just under 450,000. And in 1934, goats, and as Dale mentioned, a Spanish goat skull is the subject of the painting, Ram Skull with Brown Leaves. The goats became the target of the program in 1934 because they were thought to be particularly destructive to the range. And while government purchased many of the sheep and goats, many were so far from the rail or any type of transportation hub that they were slaughtered on the range instead of being transported. So I'm not aware of O'Keefe commenting on these policies or the specific conditions because of the policies, but she did write about traveling through and picking up the bones in the regions where these programs were implemented and would have known people that were impacted or involved. And when we are reading O'Keefe's statements and writing on the bones found in the landscape, they don't really consider the difficult context around why they may have been covering the desert or the impact on the communities. Slide, please. So she writes later about, in her 1970s autobiography about studying bones on her first trip to New Mexico, but doesn't really paint them until 1930, 1931. And her first bone painting is in 1930, thigh bone on black stripe. You see it behind Laura on her right. Yep. And in 1931, she writes about sending a barrel of bones back east from New Mexico and writes that summer about working on horse skull paintings over and over around this time at Lake George. So here you see a couple of Alfred Stieglitz's photographs from 1931 with O'Keefe with those skulls that she would have sent back. And she initially refers to them as trash when she's writing about sending them back to New York. In a letter to Stieglitz in July of 1931, she writes while packing, "Don't open my packages when they come. There is nothing in them that would interest you. I am sending a barrel and 2 packages aside from my box. Nothing but trash, I suppose. But it is trash that I seem to think that I'll want." She's also aware that bones were an unusual subject. When she's writing her friend and artist, Rebecca Salisbury James, she notes that they really cause a stir with her friends and family while she has them out and is working on them at Lake George. Slide, please.
And Liz, these photographs of O'Keefe that Stieglitz took would have been at Lake George?
Yes.
Interesting.
At least the one where she's hanging out of the house, there is some
Yeah,
correspondence around creating those.
got it.
So here you see the first bone painting that I mentioned from 1930 and an exhibition installation photo of the skulls first exhibited at Stieglitz's American Place Gallery at the end of 1931. And just as they caused a stir at Lake George with friends and family, they also did with the critics. And they were uncertain really what to think about them. The critics comment on them as symbols of death, or in the case of the later pelvis paintings, childlessness, menopause. Some thought that they were inspired by surrealism or interpreted them as a loss of creativity. Some associated them with spirituality or religion. However, O'Keeffe repeatedly writes and states in her interviews that it is her attempt at depicting the country and that they were really symbols of the desert for her. And contrary to what critics were saying about the moroseness and death, she repeated that the bones were, quote, strangely more living than the animals walking around, hair, eyes, and all, with their tails twitching. The bones seemed to cut sharply to the center of something that is keenly alive on the desert, even though it is vast and empty and untouchable and knows no kindness with all its beauty, end quote. Slide, please. As we mentioned, the ram skull with brown leaves, it has been identified as a Spanish goat, and the Spanish goats would have been brought over from the Spanish and Spain to the Americas early on. They were valued for their milk, their meat, their hides. They were pretty much taken everywhere the Spanish went. They were very hardy. They were rugged. They were able to survive on rough forage and in difficult environments. And they really thrived in New Mexico, and their numbers increased substantially, especially when they were spurred on by a market for mohair, which was used in the seating for the rail cars. And as I previously mentioned, in the early 1900s, livestock overgrazing was becoming an increasing concern on public lands, especially on the forest reserves, which were later designated as national forests. And many of these lands in the mountains of northern New Mexico were communal lands created by Spanish land grants and still are. And the forest officials considered the goats and the sheep as having a very severe impact on these grasslands and open woodlands, recommending that residents reduce the numbers of sheep and goats, and in some cases replace them with cattle. And this was not well received, but it happened anyways. And during the 1930s, both Hispanic and Pueblo communities in northern New Mexico kept a few head of goats in and around their villages, as they had done for centuries. In addition to milk and food and mohair, the goats were used for threshing grain seeds or beans on circular pack services. And you can see in one of the slides on the right, that's what's happening there, is a threshing process where the goats are breaking kind of the seeds from the husk. And they were also used, the rams were used to lead the flocks of sheep and goats. So they were very important to these communities. Slide, please. O'Keeffe collected many natural objects that she depicted in her paintings, and many more were given to her over the years, and people are discouraged from doing this today. Bones, plants, rocks, feathers, antlers, any of that stuff. Historical artifacts really are not to be taken, and in many cases illegal these days. So the image on the left is the skull behind me here, the Spanish goat skull in the museum's collection. And while we can't be certain that it is the exact one, it does share many of the features that are similar to the shapes of, especially like the antlers in the painting. It was documented and identified from a group of bones that were part of Georgia O'Keeffe's personal collection of bones by Victoria Monagle, with the help of Judy Chiba Smith and Sherry Sorensen during a fellowship project between the O'Keeffe Museum and the University of New Mexico's Zooarchaeology Lab. And we're very appreciative for all that identification work. Materials in the collection, like Dale said, beyond the paintings, such as the letters and the bones and the personal property, books, photos, really help us to better understand and care for and provide access to O'Keeffe's life and work, as well as the places and times and communities that she was associated with. So I'm going to hand it over now to Laura in the galleries.
Thank you so much, Liz. As my colleague said at the top of the hour, I am Laura Joseph, Director of Curatorial Affairs at the O'Keeffe Museum, and I am coming to you from our galleries in downtown Santa Fe. As you can see, I am standing in front of Ram's skull with brown leaves. Before I build on some of the ideas and the context that Liz has established, I just want to say how excited I am about this format, which is, as Dale said, a little bit of an experiment for us. Taking you on this journey from the library and archives to the galleries to the conservation studio feels really true to the way that we actually work. And so that's one of the reasons that excited me about trying this out, so that we could really give you a sense that delving in to the life of a painting fully is not something any one of us can do alone. It takes all of us collaborating across different areas of expertise and different collections to build a deep and layered understanding of a painting that we're hoping to share with you all today. So I will say a few words about the Roswell Museum and those circumstances, which is why this painting is in our galleries today. But first, I just want to situate you a little bit in the galleries themselves. I'm in a gallery that attempts with just a few small artworks to establish three distinct phases in O'Keeffe's relationship with New Mexico. The early years in which she was making these preliminary visits, starting in 1929, then the years in which she is traveling consistently from New York to New Mexico, summering in New Mexico. She used the word at one point, vacationing in New Mexico. And then the period of time in which she makes New Mexico her year-round home. So the works that you see behind me are works that represent this period of time when she's summering in New Mexico and moving back and forth actively between New Mexico and New York. And so I'm going to say a little bit more about that shortly. But before I do, it's really important to talk about the Roswell Museum and why this painting is in our care. So as Dale mentioned, in October of 2024, a catastrophic flood moved through the city of Roswell, New Mexico, which, as many of you know, is our neighboring city to the southeast. The Spring River overflowed and sent more than 5 feet of water rushing through the galleries, which is what you can see. You can see the flood line in this image that's on the screen. More than 10,000 objects in the collection were affected. And as you can imagine, the building remains closed and recovery is expected to take many years and millions of dollars. And has really demonstrated the resilience of both the Roswell community and the staff at the Roswell Museum. So as Dale mentioned, Ram's skull with brown leaves very narrowly escaped damage, which we're grateful for that. Most of the work in the Roswell Museum collection is at the Conservation Center of Chicago, but we're really grateful that the museum has entrusted us with the care of this painting. And so more than anything today, I think I want its presence in our galleries and this MWalk program to help keep their story and need for support visible. Dale mentioned the kind of amazing serendipity of the timing that the Roswell Museum was founded in 1935, the year before this painting was created, and opened the year that this painting was exhibited as part of a WPA Depression era project, again, kind of tied in with that history that Liz was sharing with us, that aimed to promote public art at centers across the United States. And while it's now run by the city of Roswell, it's one of the few federal art centers that remains in operation. It's a really critical steward of art and culture and history here in the Southwest. So please visit the link that's on the screen to find out more information and to find out how you can support. or if that's too tricky, you can very easily just search for the Roswell Art Museum online and be connected to more information. So with that, if you could advance the slide for me, please, Dale. Thank you. Liz has given us this really vivid picture of O'Keeffe's experience in New Mexico, of the landscapes that captivated her, of the bones that she found scattered across the desert, of the environmental, economic, and social conditions that contributed to their prevalence. I'm going to talk a little bit about the New York context. So while she did paint some of these paintings in New Mexico, she painted many of them in New York. And so they are often understood to be New Mexico paintings. And I kind of want to add this layer of this New York context. And I think I want to say beyond just, what's happening in her life at New York at this time, I want to sort of suggest why it matters that we understand this New York context. So there is a letter up on the screen that you can see from O'Keeffe to her friend, the filmmaker Enwar Rodakevich, who is someone she met in New Mexico. But in this letter, she's talking about how she has moved out of the Shelton Hotel. And the Shelton Hotel is where she and her gallerist and her husband, Alfred Stieglitz, had lived in the winter since 1925. And in the spring of 1936, they move into a penthouse apartment on East 54th Street. So in this letter, which you see on the screen, she describes the new space as bigger and brighter, as having a patio on three sides. She described the space as having beautiful light, and that she herself felt free and open. And she likened herself to a cat purring in the sun. And we've got some images that I'll show in just a moment that really evoke this energy of O'Keeffe feeling really warm in this space. So if you could advance to the next slide. Thank you, Dale. She described her rooftop patio as the country part of her city. And we know that the experience of living in New York City was sometimes difficult for O'Keeffe, and she particularly discussed the sort of disconnection from the natural world as being one of the sources of difficulty. So you can see in this new penthouse that she has this lovely patio space, and where she has potted plants, and there's this garden hose casually snaked across the brick flooring that gives the sense of, watering as being one of her, regular daily activities. So in another letter to Rodakevich, she explained that she had gotten a commission from Elizabeth Arden, the major cosmetics company, to create a large floral painting for their Manhattan studio. And the scale of the painting that she needed to create gave her cause to say that she needed a bigger studio space. So Stieglitz had tried to appeal to the management at the Shelton Hotel to get O'Keeffe a designated studio space. They had refused, which had given her sort of the justification to move. But she says in one of the letters to Rodakevich that she had wanted to move before this, but that the Elizabeth Arden Commission had just really given her an excuse to do so. So if you advance to the next slide, there are one back.
Oops, apologies.
Thank you. So these are some images taken by a photojournalist for a Life magazine article that would feature her bones and speculate a little bit about her bones. But what they do for our purposes is they really demonstrate what Liz was describing. O'Keeffe kind of packing up her bones that she found in New Mexico, and you can also see seashells that she found in Maine, and sending them back to her apartment in New York City. So we can really see how she incorporates these objects from other places into her New York City domestic environment, and then how they make them into her painting. So you see two white shells, one black shell, propped along the window sill with a bunch of these found objects arranged along the sill. So these are the images that I was mentioning that really demonstrate the beautiful light in the space and kind of O'Keeffe feeling like a cat purring in the sun. So I think these photographs and her letters provide justification and evidence that she did paint a number of these bone paintings in New York, not New Mexico. But in order to make that claim about ram's skull with brown leaves, we need a little bit more evidence. So next slide, please, Dale. We believe that O'Keeffe very likely painted this painting in the fall of 1936 after she returned from New Mexico. And one of the reasons we think this is because this work was discussed in a British publication in 1938. This is a digitized image of the first page of that article. And the image in the article, as you can see, featured an image of the artwork alongside the title, and all provided by an American Place, which was O'Keeffe's gallery. And the title that was provided was Ram's Skull with Autumn Leaves. So what we're likely looking at, and I think with that, you can cut the slides, Dale, so folks can see the context in the gallery. But what we're likely looking at is a painting that brings together the Spanish goat's horn from New Mexico and deciduous leaves that she gathered from somewhere in Manhattan, maybe even her own patio. So one of the things that, Liz was talking about some of the different interpretations that critics had of the work. I think one of the things that really strikes visitors, viewers about them is that the objects, the bones, are so precisely rendered, yet so completely severed from any context that would explain them, that they take on a kind of strange, dreamlike presence that has led to a lot of art historical and critical speculation and some sensationalizing of this body of work. But I think it's worth considering this quality through the lens of her distance from New Mexico. Her correspondence from this period clearly conveys the creative difficulty she experienced working so far away from the landscape that inspired her, and how much she longed to go back to New Mexico. So this painting's starkness might be her way of aesthetically resolving the disconnection from place that she was actually experiencing. And if there's any merit to this idea, the bones become very relatable to this extremely human experience of disconnection that results from missing a place, rather than being these mysterious, unknowable compositions. Liz was mentioning sort of the environmental, social, economic context in New Mexico. This was also, impacting communities around the United States. And, it's possible that the somber tone of this painting reflects some of the hardships of this time. In a letter from 1936 that she wrote from New York City, O'Keeffe acknowledged herself that money is really scarce, that the world feels crazy and hopeless. Those were her words. And in the very same letter, she mentions her new apartment and the Elizabeth Arden Commission. So she wasn't untouched by the hardships of the time, but she was also insulated from the worst of them in ways that many people around her were not. So, whether these two interpretations, this sense that the painting may express some of her dislocation from New Mexico, being painted in New York, and some of the hardships of the time, these are some of my speculations based on the archival evidence. But what we can say with certainty is that this painting is a result of her moving between two very different but deeply connected worlds at a time of environmental and economic strife. So Liz also mentioned that, as we know, O'Keeffe is very well known for refuting interpretations of her work that she did not like. And, she insisted that these paintings were symbols of the desert and nothing more. But I think the statement can lead us to understand these paintings as untethered from time. And I think what the understanding that we're building is that, of course, they are not. Ram's skull with brown leaves is inextricably tied to histories of water hardship in New Mexico, and also the resilient communities that have navigated these hardships. It may not have existed without the droughts of the 1930s. And nearly a century later, it escaped being lost to what some have described as a 500-year flood, thanks to the care and diligence of the Roswell Museum staff. So this painting really carries and signifies these histories. So before I turn it over to Dale, I just wanted to provide one more insight about the painting that's actually not that easy to see, even though you're seeing an image of it physically alongside me. But what I want to kind of cue Dale to talk more about is that, in reproductions of the painting, the surface looks really uniform. But when you're actually in front of it and you're looking at the surface of it, it's filled with a lot of dynamic surface information. And because of her wet on dry application process, there are all these ridges between colors and forms that tell a whole nother layer of this story. So I'm going to turn it over to Dale to talk about that aspect of the painting's history.
Thank you, Laura. Amazing. I mean, the way that these the art historical research and the letters, and then the historical socioeconomic research gives just brand new context and much deeper meaning to this painting. I'm going to go back and share my slides. And so for a conservator, several questions are fundamental when we're trying to determine what the state of preservation is for a work of art, and what's sort of actively deteriorating, what's old deterioration that's stable, what's happened to the work over time. So we're interested in what the structure and the appearance of the work has evidence of change over time. And there's several contexts that we're interested in, from the time of the art, from the time the artist completed the work, what's changed, from the conditions arising from the homes of private owners, from travel to and from public exhibitions, and from historic conservation treatments as well. All of those impact what it is we see in this moment. And in the next following slides, you will get to see some of that incredible surface texture that Laura was just referring to. The background paint, O'Keeffe has used short scrubbing brushstrokes to give a very heavy brush texture to that background and scatter the light, whereas in the leaves themselves, they are painted very smoothly with very translucent iron-based paints, and then the skull itself almost has its original bone texture sort of transferred to the canvas inch by inch. So the question is, what do we know about the conditions that this work has experienced during its lifetime, and what might account for the changes that we're seeing? So let's start with how the structure and the appearance of the work has changed over time, from the artist, from the moment the artist finished the work. O'Keeffe used stretchers, canvas, primers, paints, and each of those have different strengths, different elastic limits. And so they all begin to fatigue and break down over time in idiosyncratic ways that lead to different conditions at different parts of the painting. Some oil paints, for example, lead white, cobalt blue, are much more brittle over time because they're more highly oxidized, and the cumulative fatigue response, that is, microscopic changes accumulating over many, many years, accounts for many of the changes that we're seeing. Other oil paints were amended with things like waxes and oils and resins, either by the manufacturer or by the artist. And this is an interesting moment. During the Depression, many oil paint manufacturers had to cut costs in order to keep the price point low enough so that artists could continue to buy their product. And so we've seen in oil paints from this time how paint manufacturers began to add things like resins, like synthetic fats to these paints. And so it'd be interesting to me to find evidence of those in this painting. The white ground, the priming layer that's just on the canvas before the paint is applied, is the most brittle layer of all. Its pigment to binder ratio is very, very high, and it's made to be a very absorptive layer. It's made to grab onto paint and hold paint well. But because of this very high pigment layer, it's the most brittle, it's the most glass-like of all the layers. And so those layers can literally break and crack at a microscopic level, even when the artist is applying paint to the canvas during the execution of the work. As the artist applies brushwork and presses against a flexible canvas, that canvas can distort and bend back and hit the stretcher bars. And so we find that microscopic cracks in that layer at the stretcher bar can occur and ultimately work their way up into to the paints, because cracks function as a hinge in what was originally a continuous paint layer. Once there's a crack, all the movement of the canvas is focused at that hinge. And that's what forces those cracks to get more and more distorted over time. Let's look at changes that might arise from the homes of private owners. Private homes often have wide fluctuations in humidity, even when temperatures are continuously controlled to maintain human comfort levels. And the changes in humidity in a heated home can, or even in a rainstorm, can change 25% from what the equilibrium humidity is. And those extreme rapid changes have a really drastic effect, particularly on that glass layer. Paint layers behave much more tolerantly, but that glass layer, when there's a giant humidity increase or decrease in home, really have to respond. And that exaggerates these very early cracks, these microscopic cracks that begin the fatigue process that were put there by the artists themselves. And likewise in direct sun. Paint surfaces in direct sun can increase as soon as the sun hits it within minutes, as much as 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And paints really do expand a great deal when heated. They're very thin layers, and so they want to move immediately. And those movements, again, create microscopic cracks and kinds of fatigue that over time are the kinds of things we would see in the painting today. And then obviously soot from fireplaces, from tobacco smoking. Smoke soots are chemically attracted to oil surfaces. Oil attracts oil, like attracts oil, and they become chemically bonded in a very thin layer, but in ways that would also sort of distort the appearance, excuse me, of the painting over time. And of course, unprotected paint surfaces, because they're on a flexible substrate like canvas, they can be easily poked and dented from fingers looking at things or adjacent items like flowers and candlesticks. And those cracks, even though they're invisible at the time they occur, they become increasingly visible as all these factors contribute to the fatigue of the paint layer over time. And then let's look at changes that might occur from public exhibitions, from travel inside trucks and rail cars. All of those create all the hazards we've talked about, like rapid temperature and humidity changes, but increasingly then shocks and bumps and vibrations from the transit vehicles themselves. And it's important to remember that canvas paintings are essentially a drumhead. They're a membrane that's stretched over a wooden stretcher, and they behave very much like a drumhead. And so if the vibration inputs and the shock inputs are anywhere near the note that canvas happens to have because of its size, it's going to continue to absorb those vibrations and keep moving. And every time a canvas moves forward, the paints are being pulled, and every time the canvas moves backwards, the paints are being compressed. So again, it's a fatigue process over many years that ends up causing the things that we can see. And then from historic conservation treatments and repairs, those too can create changes that end up being reflected in the condition that we see in a painting at any given moment. Of course, we all assume that conservation treatments should not only repair existing damage, but help prevent the development of future damage. But that's not always the way it goes. Sometimes materials surprise us in ways that we can't produce. And that's why conservators try and use fully reversible methods, fully removable additions, so that if a change starts to occur, we can help arrest it or diminish it when changes happen in ways that we didn't immediately predict. Material chemistries, responses to movement and conditions, are all altered by conservation, many conservation treatments. Many conservation treatments when we're trying to restore the physical capabilities of a paint layer to remain adhered to the canvas so it doesn't fall off, and we're trying to repair and flatten cracks and get those lifted cracks to become more in plane. Even when we're cleaning, we can inadvertently alter the chemistry of the oil paints and the amendments that were put into the oil paints unpredictably. For years, we didn't suspect that paint manufacturers vary their ingredients in oil paintings, but in fact, they do. They respond to changes in market forces. They will add fillers. They'll add pigments that are cheaper than perhaps other pigments. And the chemistry of oil paints, while the manufacturers try and maintain the behavior of the oil paint when it's being applied, can alter how the painting will respond to our conservation treatments. So things like heat, things like cleaning solutions can all alter the chemistry in unpredicted ways. Just to summarize what the painting has gone through during its lifetime, it's interesting that O'Keeffe stored this painting after its completion and its initial exhibition. It was in storage for 12 years. And so it's sort of interesting. Going through sales records of O'Keeffe's paintings, we find that initially the skull paintings were not broadly popular within the painting purchasing audiences. They still wanted her leaves, they still wanted her flowers, but the bones were something very different. They were difficult for folks to understand, and yet O'Keeffe continues to paint them even though they're not selling. There was a second exhibition at the Whitney in 1942, and then after that exhibition, it goes back into storage for another 7 years when O'Keeffe exhibits the work at the Indianapolis Museum of Art and at the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pennsylvania. And it's at that moment that it gets seen by a buyer, and it sells in 1949. So literally from 1936 to 1949, O'Keeffe keeps and owns the work. In 1950, the owner was concerned about the stretcher bar cracks that were beginning to emerge on the surface. And this is a relatively short period of time from when the work was originally created. Yet by 1950, we know he's disturbed, and O'Keeffe authorizes her conservator, Caroline Keck, to execute a wax resin lining. Wax resin lining is a process where the original distorted canvas is adhered with a wax resin solution under heat to a secondary canvas to help repair cracks, get paints to readhere, to flatten, and to make the painting stronger over time. It's interesting that that treatment didn't seem to satisfy Barnes, and in 1955, O'Keeffe purchased the work back from Barnes through the Downtown Gallery in New York. Downtown Gallery exhibits the work in 56, and in 1957, the work is purchased from the Downtown Gallery by Winston and it was called the Winston and Marshall Group, and gifted to the Roswell Museum. And that's how it got there. And after the purchase and after conservation, it's been exhibited a number of times in lots of locations, including Berlin. So this is a raking light photo of the painting. So now what I've done is I've sort of taken the light and I've focused it from the left-hand side so that we begin to see the paint, the shadows of paint. We can begin to see the ridges that O'Keeffe applies at the edges of her forms. But we can also see the stretcher bar creases at the viewer left and viewer right side. Some of the cusps, the sort of dents that come when a painting is stretched and nailed to the tacking edges of the stretcher. So if we look at the appearance of the work, we can see the stretcher bar cracks and the creases. We can see a complex series of cracks at the top of the work, and I'll highlight those in just a second. So let's take a look. What I've done now is I've sort of highlighted where with the red where these planar deformations are. So I'll go back so you can have a look at what they look like in raking light when they're not highlighted. And perhaps many of you can start to see, do a laser here, a series of cracks right here at the top, just under the stretcher bar. That's from fingers literally coming from behind the work as somebody carries the work from the top stretcher bar and gets their fingers into the back. And so this is that fatigue process where initially a microscopic crack in the primer layer, which is the first thing to crack, ultimately acts as a hinge over time and begins to develop into cracks within the painted surface itself. A couple of hardware scars here. These are from framing screws that came through to the front of the painting. That's what those two are. And these are just the dimensions of the inside edge of the wooden stretcher frame around which the canvas is stretched. Here we're looking at the back of the canvas, and you're really looking at that secondary canvas, the lining canvas, the canvas that was adhered to the original canvas. Part of the dark color comes from the saturation of the wax resin lining solution that makes the canvas much more transparent. But what I want to point out here is the fact that even from the back, and you can sort of see the stretcher, the wooden stretcher itself, the stretcher wooden keys that help hold the stretcher bars at right angles and keep it from racking. But notice carefully that we can see the image of the painting coming through. Even so, so we can see the horns, we can see the two leaves, we can see the skull literally coming through two layers of canvas, primer, and paint. And what that tells us is that the wax resin lining definitely not only saturated the original canvas, but that wax resin lining permeated the ground layer itself and went into the paint layer, allowing this sort of almost stained glass look from the verso. So this is a much magnified version of the left-hand leaf. And what I'm trying to show you, if you look carefully, say in this area here with the contrast, those are the threads of this canvas. And what I want to point out here is that one of the intriguing differences of this artwork with many of O'Keeffe's artworks that we know were painted in New Mexico is that this is a very different canvas type than what O'Keeffe is characteristically using in her New Mexico paintings. This is a very fine weave, somewhere in the order of 70 to 80 threads per inch. So an extraordinarily fine weave canvas that O'Keeffe has used throughout the 1920s in leaf paintings and flower paintings. We see it many times. But when she gets to New Mexico, O'Keeffe starts using a twill weave canvas made by Winsor Newton. Winsor Newton sells this twill weave canvas as their best Ticken canvas, and O'Keeffe adopts this canvas in 1929 and heavily in 1930. But the fact that she's gone back to this very fine weave canvas is interesting because this fine weave canvas will distort a great deal in a painting this large. Normally, a fine weave canvas like this is used for much smaller paintings. And we see it in paintings in the galleries in our collection. It's in Corn number 2. It's in Canna Leaves. It's used in the painting Pink Tulip, which we've now have featured in Gallery 1. So it's really interesting that for whatever reason in this painting, a New York type, Lake George, New York type canvas is being used. And again, this begins to support the idea that this painting may have been painted in New York rather than New Mexico. Okay, in this photograph, what I've done, this is not a visible light photograph. What I've done here is I've taken ultraviolet light. The ultraviolet light has excited the linseed oil that the painting is made up in. The linseed oil fluoresces a yellow color, just like, you know, the old black light posters used to do in the 1960s and 1970s. Linseed oil fluoresces bright yellow. And then with every change in pigment mixture that's in the paints that O'Keeffe has applied, that yellow light hits the pigment particles and it allows us to see in great contrast exactly where O'Keeffe changes the paint layers. So what we can see, if you look closely around the skull, you can see there's a slightly duller appearance right in the margin around the skull. That's where O'Keeffe has used a little bit of bone black to create the sense of a shadow behind the skull. The same thing here on the edge of the leaf. But that a very bright lead white, you can see her brushstrokes here, is applied over that fundamental moderating base layer to add more texture and to add a much brighter background to that whole region in there. And then again, you can see the darkness in this area. This is O'Keeffe adding a little bit of bone black to create a sense of shadow, even though we don't necessarily see those contrasts immediately when we're looking at the painting as you're looking at it behind Laura right now. I've zoomed in on that ultraviolet photograph to show you a phenomenon that tells us a great deal about the effect of Keck's 1950 conservation treatment to line this original canvas to a secondary canvas. It requires the use of heat. The wax and the resins are in liquid form. And what I'm trying to point out here is these little bright aggregates. If you look carefully at the photograph, you'll see that the paint isn't exactly evenly distributed, that we see little dots of bright white paint. Those little dots of bright white paint are actually aggregations of zinc oxide, not lead white, that is on the surface of the painting, but zinc oxide that has been mobilized in the primer layer underneath the paint by the wax resin and has infused itself into the lead white region. So we can see them all in this area. We can even see some of them literally at the edge of the bone, but the lead white that's applied in the background is far more porous. And so the zinc white from the primer layer has moved through. This indicates a chemical reaction going on called metal carboxylate soap. And it's a process that requires moisture changes, and these small aggregates of zinc oxide will turn into a zinc stearate or a zinc soap, a zinc fat, and they'll move through the paint layer, ultimately breaking through like small blisters on the surface of the painting. Understanding that chemistry allows us to frame this work with a microclimate environment that will hold the moisture content stable within the frame itself. And so we've actually tried to arrest that reaction from occurring. I'm going to go through the next series of slides. This is, again, a reflected ultraviolet light, not a fluorescent light, but it shows us some very interesting things. Laura mentioned O'Keeffe painting wet into dry paint. So an initial mid-tone layer comes in and is painted. So if we look at the skull, even though it looks very uniform, when we look at it in reflected ultraviolet light, we can see individual brushstrokes being applied, both the highlight right here over the mid-tone. So there's the highlight, as well as these darker tones and these darker shades of yellow ochre that she applies over the dry paint. If the paint underneath hadn't been dry, then we would see a blending brushstroke. But here we're seeing individual brushstrokes. So this form of imaging helps us understand exactly the sequence that O'Keeffe applies the paint in that painting. And here we're looking at an infrared transmitted view where we're shooting infrared light from behind the work. And it tells us one more interesting thing. Thicker paints look darker. Paints with carbon in them look darker. And then thinner paints look lighter. But what's really interesting when we look at the detail is what we're starting to see here. And if you look carefully, here's a good example of a very fine craquelure pattern that's occurring in the ochre paints here and in the thicker paints here. And if you look carefully, it's occurring here and even to a degree right in this initial shadow layer that O'Keeffe paints. If you look carefully, you can see those small cracks. What that tells us is that during the lining process, something had been pulled out of those paints. Something had been extracted, something that was heat sensitive and resin and solvent sensitive, and it got migrated back through the back of the painting, through the primer layer and into the canvas. And those are the amendments that I was talking about from those Depression era paints. When paint manufacturers were adding synthetic fats and oils to their paint mixtures to try and keep the price point low enough during the Depression. So we're seeing Depression era paints reflected in this period, which suggests that they may be, instead of being new paints that O'Keeffe takes to New Mexico in 1936, they are perhaps Depression era paints that are back at her 54th Street studio in New York, again, sort of leading us to believe that those might be there. And this is another shot being able to see those cracks. So we have an amazing story when we bring all these resources together, of a painting that may have been painted in New York, may have been painted using Depression era paints. The evidence is all there. It's interesting that it's in such really relatively good shape that O'Keeffe stored the painting, and it didn't sell for a long period of time after it was first exhibited, along with all the historical references that help us understand why O'Keeffe saw the bones initially on the landscape and why she found them so inspiring the way she did flowers. And at this point, I'll stop sharing. And the idea here is that we would have a brief discussion with our panelists, and then have lots of time for questions from the audience. Liz, Laura, Molly?
Hey. I just want to quickly thank the three of you, and Grace Almanza, who's off camera doing technical support in the gallery, for bringing forth such a dynamic conversation. It's so incredible how a painting can really be a porthole through which we can see what an economy was like at the time of its creation, what an artist's state of mind was, what the art market was like. And the story that you told with this painting was such a wonderful example of that. So thanks to the three of you. And I'll hop back off camera if the three of you wanted to, comment on each other's pieces of the presentation. But we do have some questions populating in the chat, so we can carry forth however the three of you would like.
Let's go to questions.
All right. Let's see. We do have a question about the title of the painting. So we know from your presentation that the painting does depict a Spanish goat skull, but that the painting is titled Ram Skull. So is there any sort of additional context for the differentiation between the title and the actual animal?
Well, it certainly is. It is the male Spanish goat. So it is the ram Spanish goat that is depicted there, that have those wonderful twisted horns as characteristic of it. And Liz, it was in your talk, I thought it was fantastic, in your research, how you found that this particular species of goat is so well suited to the northern New Mexico environment that it can survive on scrub, that it grows even with marginal foods, and it produces wool as well as meat. That was interesting.
Yeah, and actually, most of the Spanish goats, they began crossbreeding them with the Angora goat because of the ability for it to produce the mohair. There really aren't that many Spanish goats, from what I understand, anymore, most of them. But I would say, like, in terms of the titling and her identifying the types of skulls in animals, there are other instances. I mean, titling, I think she was a little loose with that for a long time. And many of her paintings are untitled. So I don't think that was like she wasn't particularly focused on identification in titling.
And some of the initial titles were in some cases given by Stieglitz. So, it's unclear, which titles are hers and which may have been descriptive titles by him. I will just say that it's so fun because I learned things in real time, just to see how, to prove our our test that, it really does take all of this information woven together to have this deep understanding, and that it was quite exciting for me to see that play out in real time. And one other thing I'll say that is exciting is that the museum is now open. So you get the real vibrancy of the coming live from the museum. So there may be some visitors joining me on the screen.
Thank you, Laura. Laura is truly broadcasting live from the museum, which, yes, that's just really cool. And I'm excited for visitors to the museum to be able to see this live program from your perspective as well for the next 20 minutes or so. We have lots of questions spilling in. A couple of them are referencing the leaves in the painting. So we have some folks wondering if we know exactly what the leaves are, if those have been identified, knowing that they're probably from the East Coast based on the presentation, but if we know what they are exactly, and if the scale of the leaves, in your opinions, has been altered as well, or are we thinking they were pretty small, or have they been enlarged to enhance, the sort of dreamlike quality of the painting? Any other additional thoughts on the leaves?
Uh, I'm
Laura,
not.
there you go. There
Yeah,
you go.
I'll get us started. I'm not. I'm as far as I know, the leaves have not been definitively identified. We have, discussed the possibility of rhododendron leaves, of tobacco leaves, but at this stage, those are guesses. I will say, one of the things that O'Keeffe consistently does across this body of work is distorts scale. So again, we don't know for sure if these are true to scale or not, but I would venture to guess they are not. And one of the things that we see her kind of consistently doing, and you can see it in Horse's Skull with white rose and Ram's Skull with brown leaves, is juxtaposing these hard and enduring forms with these softer and more fleeting forms. And again, she really resisted the idea that this was any reflection on life and death. But whether her interest in this juxtaposition was formal or more conceptual, again, we won't know. But there is a consistent interest in bringing these two forms that decay differently together. Dale,
Yeah, I
Liz, do you
agree.
have?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think it really is fascinating, and that the leaves are so large, and that they create a kind of tension as they sit so close to the bottom edge of the canvas, almost about to fall through or penetrate. They somehow look, fragile, and then there's this very, this persistent bone, this hard bone and horn object that floats, and the scales seem to me to be deliberately distorted. The skull itself, the distance, I don't know if you can see behind Liz there, the original skull, but the distance between the tips of the skull, that's close to 30 inches across. So in many ways, this painting is 36 inches horizontally. The skull is almost to scale in this painting, which would make the leaves enormous. So I think you're right. She's preventing us from quickly identifying these objects and sort of forcing us to take a close look at the paint itself by changing scale. Liz?
Yeah, I think in reading through a bunch of the correspondence from that year, it does seem like this is, I agree, like that not created in New Mexico, and that these leaves are not like from the West, that they are from the East. And yeah, I do not know of them being identified, but I do think, yeah, that the scale of it is intentionally large, yeah, from what we know.
One other quick thing that interests me is that fold over in the leaf and the way in which, it causes me to think about materiality whenever I've, handled a dried leaf. If, the sides are so brittle, they crack, when bent. And so just kind of how it makes me think about the materiality of a leaf and, what is real and what is not possible, what's not physically possible. That fold is really something that I come back to when I'm looking at the painting.
And she's depicted the folds in that viewer left-hand leaf, not as being sort of the brown veined,
Right.
dried surface. It becomes almost a soft surface. So again, there's a kind of um, you know paradoxical um, composition here that just doesn't offer many answers to these questions.
We do have several folks in the Q&A speculating that those could be magnolia leaves. That seems to be a popular speculation. So maybe one of you leaf experts can come down and help us identify the leaf for sure. But after I'm going through some questions, and it's probably not a surprise that there are lots of questions related to the conservation of the piece. And I'm going to give a shout out to Draven. Draven was an intern here at the O'Keeffe Museum last summer, and I know that she's interested
Hi,
in
Draven.
conservation. Yay. And so Draven has a question. When cracks in a painting are fixed, are you using paint to repair those cracks or some sort of chemical adhesive, maybe a combination of those things? And then to piggyback on that question more broadly, what are the future plans for conserving this piece?
So great questions. And I mean, one of the initial reasons why Roswell loaned us the painting was so that we could give it a, very detailed, obviously, with lots of different kinds of imaging, translucent infrared, reflected and fluorescent UV, to try and understand state of preservation. And in reality, I think the humidity of the flood precipitated some of the cracks to break apart, get wider, and there was some minor soiling. So all of that conservation was carried out before we put it in the microclimate environment, after we had done all the analysis and we knew what the paints were and how the paints had changed and migrated from the 1950 treatment. So in this case, trying to consolidate or repair those cracks so that they were no longer kind of, a broken paint layer with two separate islands, but to try and get them integrated again so that it was a continuous paint layer that would again behave the way it was originally intended. I had to select an adhesive to adhere that paint back down onto the canvas with something that would adhere to obviously canvas and the primer layer itself, the zinc white in linseed oil, and then the lead white, the modified lead white that was in fact, the paint on the surface of it. So it had to be an adhesive that had a number of qualities that was polar and would adhere to polar materials, but also had a non-polar component so that it would adhere to the oil paint as well. That's a difficult thing. So I selected an adhesive called polyoxazoline. It has a big nitrogen polar group on it, and it also has a long chain oil-like group on it. So it matches the things we want to adhere chemically. It is fully reversible so that you can extract it from a crack just using water or a little bit of isopropyl alcohol, for example. The isopropyl alcohol allows us to apply the adhesive into the surface of the crack, and the lack of surface tension allows the adhesive to flow into the gaps where the paint has lifted off the surface of the canvas. So mechanically, that's the way that behaves and the way it matches well chemically to the different surfaces. And then the other beautiful thing about polyoxazoline, the brand name is Aquazol, is that you can obtain it from the manufacturer in different molecular weights. So that is that the polymer itself can be very short or can be very long, and the different molecular weights carry with them different flexibilities and different strengths. So it's really important when we're repairing a crack like this that we not use a super strong adhesive, right? So we don't use something that has a huge molecular weight, even though that adds some flexibility, because we don't want to make the adhesive bond stronger than the original paints that surround it, that it's bonding to. If we did that, then the adhesive would just be rigid and the paints surrounding it would just break off, right? So we have to match, we even have to make the adhesive slightly less strong than the surrounding paints. And so those adhesives allow us to do that. So we're bringing a crack that's sort of like this and out of plane, and we're getting them back in plane, and we're getting those edges to meet. If some of those edges where they're brought back down and adhere to the canvas below have flaked off, that's when we would add a small amount of paint so that the crack is less obvious to the normal viewer in the gallery. So we might want to disguise that a little bit. We don't use oil paints to do that because we don't want to confuse what we're doing as a contemporary repair with O'Keeffe's original paints. So again, a good answer here is a synthetic paint like a watercolor, easy to match the gloss, easy to match the color. And in fact, there is watercolors that are made with the same thing as the adhesive, the polyoxazoline, which makes it really easy to take off.
Thank you so much. It's so very exciting to hear from an expert about how these things work. And there were many questions in the chat about that. So thank you so much, Dale. Here's a question for Liz and also for Laura about the photographs that you chose to include in your portions of the slideshows. Just that there were some photos that folks had never seen before, and then it was really special to be able to see those photographs situated in a context that tells the story behind this painting. Is there any advice or thoughts that you could share with people who might want to dig into photos of O'Keeffe or of her life that they could access from home, which we could talk a little bit about our new Access O'Keeffe website, which has a digital catalog raisonné, or essentially all of the photographs of works that O'Keeffe completed that are known, which you can access online. But from a research perspective, would Liz or Laura or Dale, do any of you have anything you want to add about how you found these lovely photos and where folks can start digging on their own?
Sure. So we do have a bunch of them digitized, and you can find them on Access O'Keeffe. These are photos from our archival collections and our art collection. We also photo research prior to really having a digital presence and doing a lot of digitization was a main reason why people would come to the library and archive. So we have a pretty rich photo archive here at the museum. I will also say shout out to our neighbors. I really had a wonderful time getting into the New Mexico digital collections online. They're always digitizing new things from all the different institutions across the state and adding new things. So like the 1936 photo that I had put up, that was one that was actually new to me of O'Keeffe sitting on the portal with the male. And and I always just appreciate those like kind of like informal, less staged images of O'Keeffe and in her surroundings. Like that's a lot of how we figure out what's going on in her, especially in her historic properties and what objects were in them when. So we're often looking at these, photos to try to glean like how to actually care for our collection and what was in what place when, objects in the collection. So I would say a lot of these are easily available for you to find in the New Mexico digital collections online. And then yet we're always digitizing our collections and adding more to Access O'Keeffe.
And I'll just piggyback on that to shout out to Dale, who, encouraged me to look at the Library of Congress images for a rotation that we're planning for the existing museum that's focused on O'Keeffe's years in New York. And I showed, the one with the shells and the bones and the painting, which does so much amazing work, and the lighting. But then there's the other image that was also taken a part of that series with her with an unknown to me, a woman on a bed. And I, just echo what Liz is saying, how exciting it is to find, there's so many staged photographs, which in and of themselves have a lot to tell us about how O'Keeffe wanted to be seen, how, the photographer's vision with whom she was collaborating to stage her vision. And this was happening, from her earliest years with Stieglitz. So, I love those moments where you feel like you get, and this is only the perception of the viewer, staged versus unstaged is all in perception. But but nevertheless, that give you a sense of more of her day-to-day living. That's why I loved that, the hose and the way it was so casually kind of strewn across the patio, not not circled around, a container as you do sometimes if you're trying to keep your patio organized, but really suggesting that it was something she used a lot. I will also say there's just an amazing amount of resources digitized. So the Library of Congress, I'm not sure how recently have digitized all the correspondence between Stieglitz and O'Keeffe and Anwar Rodakevich. And they have this open source way of transcribing that correspondence. So, so much of that work is done for you. So that's so much fun, as an art historian. And I just love following sort of the rabbit holes of archival research and seeing where it takes you. But in this day and age, it's so much easier when you can find so many resources online, so many things that are in the public domain, like more of kind of publications are available on, I think it's Internet Archive, or there's a source where you can find lots of camera work and, the Apollo publication from 1938 that's digitized. That's a pretty big gift as a researcher that you don't have to travel to repositories to see all of these things. So but yes, Access O'Keeffe is an incredible resource that for O'Keeffe researchers and enthusiasts. There's still features that are being rolled out, and this is phase one of that tool, but it's really already been a game changer for research for me.
Great, thank you all. Yes, so there's plenty to look at. Everyone is encouraged to start their own rabbit hole journeys, which is such a fun and rewarding thing to do. We have about 5 minutes left of the program, but I do want to make sure I take a moment to acknowledge this comment from Jessica at the Roswell Museum, who says there are Roswell Museum folks on the call, and just a thank you for highlighting the painting and for talking about the story of the Roswell Museum. And so is there anything else that the three of you would like to add about the Roswell Museum, or anything else we can talk about with regard to the painting and the museum?
Well, I'll just say, as a New Mexican, for the past almost 35 years, that my family and I frequently went to the Roswell Museum. It was one of our favorite resources because not only was there an incredible New Mexico art collection that had been built over many, many years, from artists in the 20s and 30s all the way through contemporary Hispanic artists like Luis Jimenez working in fiberglass, and but it also had the original workshop and machine shop of Goddard's original experiments in rocketry, and it's an enormous loss to not be able to just go to Roswell and spend hours within the museum. And I know we wish them the speediest and fullest of recoveries.
Yeah, I just want to echo, thank you all so much for tuning in, for entrusting us with the painting, and for your incredible resilience. And we've got a little QR code on our label, hoping to direct people to learn more. As I said, that's one of the most important purposes of this program, is to try to generate more visibility and awareness of the support and encouragement that you all deserve.
Thank you so much. And in our follow-up email that we always send after these programs, we will include a link to that website that was mentioned earlier in the program. And thank you both so much. Overwhelmingly, what I'm seeing now in the chat is a request to keep the format alive. So it sounds as though this was a wonderful experience for many folks who are just interested to take deep dives into specific O'Keeffe paintings and to hear from several experts on the topic. I'll pick a couple to share with you before we wrap up. But I'll say, let's see, share from Anna. Thank you for taking the time to provide this amazing session. I learned a lot, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to connect, even though I'm not in New Mexico. So thank you, Anna. And also seeing a few folks saying, what if you all did this 2 or 3 times a year with specific O'Keeffe paintings? So some food for thought for the three of you, and just many, many, many thank yous from folks who were able to set some time aside this morning. With 1 minute left of the program, is there anything else the three of you would like to share before we wrap up, other than maybe whether you'll commit to doing this again in the future?
It really was fun for all of us, and what we've tried to convey to you all, I think, is how fascinating this discovery pathway is when you have the unique, deep, rich resources of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, when you have the archives, when you have the art historical experts, when you have the technical capability, and you can bring all those together. All the things that O'Keeffe knew when she created the painting begin to reveal themselves through this kind of discovery process. And I absolutely love it. I mean, it's like why I'm here.
Yeah, I'll second that. It's really a pleasure to be able to kind of do the deep dives and support like research in this area. And I really appreciate all the interest in it because it really is a motivator for me. And doing my job in the library and archive is working with researchers and people who express their interest in the topic. So thank you all to everyone viewing, and would love to invite you to come to the library and archive and make an appointment and continue it your research yourself too.
Yeah, that's really important, Liz. The library and archive, folks, is open to the public by appointment. You can yourselves be right here and see these resources.
And I have nothing to add. That was all beautiful. And just to echo that, the only thing is I have to figure out some ear pods that stay in my ears, but I'm on it. I'm
Amazing.
in.
Well, thank you again. Thank you, Dale, for bringing forward the idea to do this. And the three of you who also set aside rehearsal time to make sure it would sound and look great for the audience today, and just for all the time and the energy. We so appreciate it. And for those of you who are with us, we are grateful for your time as well. We hope you'll join us for the next Mornings with O'Keeffe, and we will definitely send you a follow-up note with that information about the Roswell Museum and other ways to stay connected. But in the meantime, we wish you a wonderful rest of the week. And thanks to our esteemed panel again for all of your time and expertise. We so appreciate it.
Thanks for
Thank you for
moderating,
the beautiful
Molly.
hosting, Molly.
Hey, thanks so much. Have a wonderful day.
Bye, everybody.